All right, y'all. Welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. And our next guest is Murray Polner. He was the editor of Present Tense, published by the American Jewish Committee from 1973 through 1990. He wrote Rabbi, The American Experience, co-edited with Stefan Merkin, Peace, Justice, and Jews, Reclaiming Our Tradition, as well as No Victory Parades, The Return of the Vietnam Veteran, and with Jim O'Grady, Disarmed and Dangerous, a biography of Daniel and Philip Berrigan. His most recent book is We Who Dared Say No to War, American Anti-War Writing from 1812 to Now, co-authored with the great Thomas Woods. And he's got this article at the History News Network that's been reprinted today at LouRockwell.com. It's called The Road to Hell, a review of To End All Wars, a story of loyalty and rebellion, 1914 through 1918. Welcome to the show, Murray. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine.
I'm very happy to have you here. Very interesting article. And, I'm just so busy these days. It's so hard for me to get books read. I thought, well, good. I'll just interview a guy who did a good book review, and it'll be just like I just read a great new book about World War I. So tell me, already you're a historian and an expert. What did you learn from this book, To End All Wars?
I was amazed with the brilliance of Adam Hochschild's new book, To End All Wars, which is subtitled A Story of Loyalty and Rebellion, 1914 to 1918. It even made the front page of the New York Times Sunday Book Review with a group of Britons from that period, mostly suffragettes, but also a few males who had not been conscripted, standing with a big sign, Peace. And it just struck me. And I read the book, and I think it's one of the great books I've ever read in years. So when I read it, I said, I have to write about it. So I started writing about it for different publications in different ways, and then I wrote about it for the History News Network, which is sponsored by George Mason University. I happen to be one of their trade book reviewers, history reviewers, and LouRockwell.com picked it up, and I'm very proud of that, too.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting essay here, and, on top of that, your recommendation just now sure makes it sound like one to run out and get. Again, it's To End All Wars, a story of loyalty and rebellion by Adam Hochschild. So what's so illuminating about this book? What makes it different than, maybe what you'd expect?
Well, what makes it different is that the World War I was an extraordinary event in Western history, but it was more than Western history because it involved countries outside of Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe. But it was an extraordinary dividing line, and most extraordinary, there is no such thing as World War II. World War II should really be World War I-A, because it was a direct result of World War I, which caused the death of tens and tens of millions of people. It was the use of scientific and industrial warfare. It was attacks on civilians, where normally in Western Europe and in Central Europe, the wars did not deliberately target civilians. As we know, all the wars since then, and especially World War II and our current, God knows, 2, 3, 4 wars do. And as I said, the war was a slaughterhouse. It consumed millions of soldiers and volunteers and reservists and draftees and so forth. But more than this, and it was, as the conservative Secretary of War in the David Lloyd George British cabinet, he called it the prostitution of science for purposes of sheer destruction. He wrote this in a letter to the Times of London, which was pro-war and refused to publish it. So this is what struck me, but also what makes this book very different, because there have been lots of books on World War I, this battle and that battle. We have some of these battles. At the Battle of Passchendaele, 300,000 soldiers killed within a couple of days. It was a global war, but what's different in this book is that he deals with primarily Britons, but also a few French, and a few Russians, and a handful of Germans, but primarily British, who refused to support the war. Many of them call themselves conscientious objectors or pacifists. And we learn from the book that 6,000 British men were jailed rather than fight. A few, as in World War II, in our country were sentenced to death, but nobody was ever actually executed except for soldiers who, for one reason or another, couldn't go on. They didn't know anything about the shocks resulting from war then, or they didn't want to know. And so you have all of these things. And he mentions people like the sister of the British general who commanded British forces in France, who opposed the war, and yet she loved and was always close to her brother. She mentions a suffragette family, one mother and one daughter, ardent supporters of the war, two daughters, ardent opponents of the war, and they refused to talk. She mentions Bertrand Russell, who was probably he mentions the best known of the opponents. And what the British tried to do is what the United States tried to do in the Vietnam War, try to crack down on people who opposed the war, just as this country used Edgar Hoover's FBI, which, as I say, Bertrand Russell also publicly opposed. In the United States, several hundreds were jailed for not supporting the war, refusing to be drafted. I mentioned Eugene V. Debs, the great British-American socialist and labor union leader of the railway union, who was jailed by the Wilson administration because he was opposed to draft in the war, and which Tom Woods and I cover in our book, our last book on We Who Say No to a War. And he was not released. Wilson refused to release him till after, as I said, the much maligned, and I often think somewhat fairly maligned, Warren Harding became the president, and with some prodding from others, he finally pardoned Eugene Debs. And as I said, and not until 2006, following a campaign organized by a citizens group, British citizens group, called Shot at Dawn, 2006, the British finally pardoned more than 300 soldiers who had been executed during World War I. So this was what made it fascinating. Two things, but more primarily, having won a Pyrrhic victory, Germany signed this treaty which the victorious Allies insisted made them solely responsible for the war. Germany was probably primarily responsible for the war, but none of them were blameless, none of them, because this was a war of empires, and they were all eager to grab more colonies in Asia and in Africa. And this virtually assured another war in the harsh terms.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the way I remember it, the British Empire expanded by 1 million square miles. I read that, I think, in Pat Buchanan's Churchill revisionist history of World War II.
Yeah, well, of course, the French expanded, and even this was a war that had nothing to do with, quote, human rights.
Right, there really were no good guys, right? There were small groups of people obviously defending themselves from these imperial powers, but none of the imperial powers you could say were good guys and bad guys. Like, it's a lot easier for the narrative when you look at World War II with the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese on one side and America on the other.
There are very few, even today, there are very few good guys and bad guys. There are always good guys and bad guys.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I'm just speaking even just for narrative purposes, but I'm sorry, we'll have to hold it right there, Murray, and go out to this break. Everybody, it's Murray Polner. His most recent book is co-edited with Tom Woods. It's We Who Dared Say No to War, a compendium of great anti-war speeches and writings throughout American history. I highly recommend it. We'll be right back. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Murray Polner. He's the author of a bunch of books, including We Who Dared Say No to War, co-edited with Thomas E. Woods, Jr., It's a compendium of great anti-war writings from 1812 through today in American history, all American stuff. And he's got a piece today at LouBrockwell.com, ran previously at the History News Network, called The Road to Hell. And it's a review of To End All Wars, a story of loyalty and rebellion, 1914 through 1918, by Adam Hochschild. And Hochschild, I don't know how to say it.
Hochschild.
Yeah, okay. It seems like oh, maybe I'm reading it a typo here with the S in the wrong place. There you go. I'm blaming the typo. All right. Anyway, so you were saying what makes this book so great is it really tells the story of the major players in the wars, but also important anti-war figures of note mixed in there, which has got to be nice because I guess you can read about a lot of those people, but maybe not in the context of the larger war that they were dissenting from, huh?
Well, what happens is, and it's it's just easier for Americans if they know their own, or any people to know their history. Americans generally know less history than many Europeans do of their own history, it seems to me. But it's easier to think about general this and president this and chancellor this and Kaiser this and so forth, rather than the people who really were the brave people. That is, the soldiers who, and Hochschild is very sensitive about them, the soldiers who, whether they supported the war or didn't support the war, and this is true of soldiers, many of all wars, simply went because they thought it was their duty. And then when they were there, fought as best as they could or didn't fight as best as they could because of their loyalties to their comrades. What we have here is the story of people who were brave enough to say no. In the book that Tom Woods and I did, it was not simple because it requires a great deal of courage to stand and say, I won't do this and I won't do that. It's one thing when you find that the most prominent people in your country support a particular war. In the book, To End All Wars, I don't know if many of them are fairly well known. John Buchan, who wrote Mysteries, Galsworth, the writer, Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame, and of course Winston Churchill, who never saw a war he didn't love, and Rudyard Kipling was featured in there. This living room warrior, who never served in the military, got his son, who was rejected initially by the British military, even though they needed every body. And he got him into the service. He was 18 when he was killed in battle, and suddenly his deeply, profoundly aggrieved father and mother, he was the perennial flag waver, composed this little epitaph to the war in which he said, if any question why we died, tell them our fathers lied. And, and so forth. And lots of books were written after the war. One of the reasons that when people counsel opposition to the war in other wars that followed, we're often hit with the notion that we're appeasers because we didn't understand Munich. Well, you see, when one reads a book like this, one sees how in Britain, especially, but also in France, the tremendous loss of soldiers. Virtually every family was hit by a loss. I remember having a professor at college. He had studied after the war in Germany and in France. He was getting his doctorate. And he said that he would see countless numbers. In many communities, there were very few men of a certain age. They'd been killed. But in other cases, when he'd see them, they would be without faces or arms or legs. They had been so badly hurt in the war. I always remember, and I'm not a libertarian, especially, I'm not anything, but I remember when Harry Browne, who ran for the presidency on the widely ignored libertarian ticket in 2000, but at least for me, memorably said, war is genocide. I'm trying to remember if I can think of the quote. Torture, cruelty, propaganda, dishonesty, and slavery. War is the worst obscenity government can inflict upon its subjects. It makes, here it is, I got the quote, it makes every other political crime that we read about in the tabloid press and on TV, makes every other political crime, corruption, bribery, favoritism, vote buying, graft, dishonesty, seem petty. And this is what they discovered. And people wrote about it after. And when they talk about Munich, the British people saluted and cheered on Neville Chamberlain, who was no bargain, but they because Chamberlain himself understood what the loss had meant to the British people, the losses had meant to the British people when their sons and husbands and grandsons and nephews and so forth were all killed or badly wounded in that horrible war. And we, in America, except for the Civil War and World War in the 19th century, when we know that approximately 600,000 plus were killed on both sides, not to mention those who were wounded or who developed what we would call PTSD, post-traumatic syndrome, that we talk about now, of the minimum of 58,000 killed in Vietnam, and God knows every day the New York Times publishes, to its great credit, the list of young soldiers who were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Just today, 2 or 3 in Iraq and 2 or 3 from in Afghanistan. So the wars go on, and the politicians and people are distracted. A well-known writer who's now dead that I knew once wrote an essay in which he called something like "Entertainment is our business," and that's a paraphrase. And this is what we are distracted by. I remember watching a very interesting television show, which I think now is on DVD, when Robert McNamara, who repented, and he was reviewing 13 Days, the riveting film about the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And he told the PBS audience he believed, I was struck by that, the world had been closer to nuclear war than even depicted in the movie. Personally, I remember standing at the Isaiah Wall at the UN in Manhattan with a friend, and we thought the world might be coming to an end, and we were talking about our children at the time. So all of this always has led me to believe that, I don't know, we who oppose war haven't got all the answers by any means, but I would suggest that the generals and the politicians, mostly the politicians, and the editorial writers, and the op-ed screamers, and the think tank subsidized shouters haven't got any answers themselves. And one of the things that I and others have tried to do, apparently we hope with some success one day, Horton once wrote a piece called "Let's Look Right and Left Too." And I said that libertarians, conservatives, liberals, radicals, all those get to know each other in terms of their anti-war counterparts. One of the things that Tom and I did, he's much more, that we didn't agree on everything, but two things we agreed on when we decided to do that book, and that is we oppose vehemently war, and secondly, we were also opposed to violations of our civil liberties. All the rest we put aside. And so all of these struck me as I read this, what I consider this extraordinary book, To End All Wars. He also wrote a great book once called King Leopold's Ghost, a story of greed, terror, and heroism in colonial Africa. King Leopold of Belgium.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one. I'm sorry, we'll have to leave it there. Maybe save that interview for another time, Murray, but I really appreciate your time on the show today. It's been great.
Thank you.
Everybody, that's Murray Polner. The article is on LouRockwell.com today. It's called The Road to Hell, a review of Adam Hochschild's To End All Wars, a story of loyalty and rebellion 1914 through 18.